Unfortunately for all of you, you're actually stuck with me for the next almost hour. Thankfully, I'm joined in this fireside chat by three significantly more qualified nonprofit leaders, Krista Thompson, Navita Narani, and Andrea Tang. Krista Thompson is the Executive Director of Covenant House Vancouver, an institution that is so important and so well known to many of us here today. Fun fact, my third volunteering gig ever when I was 15 was at Covenant House on Drake Street in the basement sorting clothes. It's a true story. And it's still one of my favorites. Navita Narani is the Executive Director of Art Starts, where we will be having our evening event at 5:15 today. Every day, Navita uses her background in the arts and business to encourage young people through the medium of art to think critically and express themselves creatively. Andrea Tang I don't know why I did that out of order. I apologize. Andrea Tang is the manager of Philanthropic Relations at the Terry Fox Foundation, an institution that makes me, and I hope each of you, so proud to be Canadian. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're here today to talk about impact measurement, and I wanted to start by asking each of you a question, and that question is simple. Who cares about the impact the work you do every day? I hope it's all of you. But my next question, slightly facetiously, is who came to the nonprofit sector to be an administrator? Says the charity lawyer, right? My last question is how many of you care about the impact of the work of the organizations that you donate to? In fact, there's a ton of data that shows that donors deeply care about the work being done. But all of us obviously care about the work being done because that's why we're in this sector, to make change, to make positive impact. But donors are joined by grantors, foundations, and governments in asking their organizations they're supporting to track their impact. If they're asking us, we definitely should be asking ourselves, is the work we're doing actually helping? Is the work we're doing actually positively impacting the communities that we work in? And if it's not, why the heck are we doing it? These questions are not so simple, and we're going to dig into that over the next 45 minutes. Before we start into the substantive things, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about the organizations that you work for and what your role is and why you care about impact measurement.
Well, that's a small subject, isn't it, Najid? For those of you who don't know, Covenant House is an organization that walks alongside at-risk and homeless kids on a journey to independent adulthood. In a nutshell, that's what we do. And so, and I came to Covenant House with a background as an at-risk kid myself. So when I was a teenager, I was a homeless kid. I knew why I was homeless. I knew how I got there. I knew that I didn't have the supports of my family. I knew a lot about why kids are homeless. So when I was lucky enough to land my dream job in, many years ago, I kind of had a really clear vision that if an organization had the right tools, they could actually change the trajectory of a young person's life, like for real. So I believe very strongly that organization like mine can make a difference in the arc of a young person's life. And so when I'm out raising money or when I'm talking to my team, we're talking a lot about how both the donor's dollar is making a difference, and also how I as a CEO and my teams are making a difference in the lives of young people.
So I'm at the Terry Fox Foundation, and we're the fundraising arm for the Terry Fox Research Institute. For the foundation, really, of course, bringing in money and bringing in the most efficient way is very important to us, but also we're based in community. Last year, we hit 10,000 community and school runs across the country and in 32 countries internationally, 100% led by volunteers. So for us, yeah, it's incredible, and so for us to just the impact that we're having in the community, just spreading the importance of cancer research, the progress we're making in cancer research, how we have to continue, but also I think the message that that Terry brings, that one can make a difference. The majority of our run participants, we're at over 3.5 million participants across the country that we estimate. The majority of them are kids and youth in schools, talking to their aunts and uncles, going to their friends with their little pledge sheets. So spreading that message that, Terry always said that he wasn't, the smartest one out there or the most athletic one out there, but he worked really hard and he had a dream, and that if you have a dream and you work hard, that anything is possible. So that's a part of our mission as well. Prior to the Terry Fox Foundation, so a little bit about my role. Actually, it's new. We're really looking at developing new donor segmentation, planned giving, monthly giving, major giving. That's actually all new at the foundation, because to date, the majority of our resources have really been to kind of steward our run organizers and looking at the events that we have. Prior to the Terry Fox Foundation, I spent about 12 years in international development. My last role was with Sparrowway, formerly Feed the Children Canada, and I was a director of programs, and I managed programs in about 6 countries in food and nutrition programs, education programs, and healthcare, all with the goal to relieve poverty and to have healthier communities.
My name is Navita, and I'm the Executive Director at Art Starts in Schools. And for us, our big why and what we're really working to achieve is to really elevate and expand the role of art in education. And we really believe that art is not something to be siloed and superfluous and off to the side in a separate subject, but something that's really integrated and essential as part of the learning experience for kids. And so if you can imagine, the journey for a child going through the education system, there's a lot of information that they are trying to make sense of and try to figure out, their place in the world and how are they going to use this to be figuring out their futures. And the arts are this natural way of making it really personal and hands-on and experiential. And so Art Starts as an organization that really promotes the value of the arts in education. And so we work with professional artists and every single public and private school across British Columbia to help bring back and influence the perception and the value of art in children's lives. We're going to fortunately have the opportunity to do some celebrations over at Art Starts this evening, and in that space we have a children's art gallery where we actually show to the community, this is what arts in education looks like. When learning is activated by the arts, this is how many connections and how much energy can come through an educational journey. And when a child makes sense of their learning, then imagine how they'll be able to be contributors of society in the future. Oh, impact.
Why do we care about impact? All of you, I get to ask this question. Why do you care about impact? And we're going to go into what it is and how to measure. But why are you sitting here? You guys are all busy people.
I think for us, or for the perspective that I have really been thinking about, is to learn. If we're leading an organization and we have so much day-to-day administrative, responsibility, and we're so busy and we spend these long hours with amazing, talented team members, impact is important because we need to be able to learn and navigate this day-to-day work. Otherwise, really, what's the purpose of it all? So for me, the simple answer is to learn.
I think for me, impact is just so important, and it's really about efficiencies. How do we best allocate our resources from an organizational standpoint? And how do we best allocate our resources to make the strongest impact, to move closer towards our mission, towards our objectives. But also from a funder's perspective, it's not even just important anymore. It's absolutely necessary. And I think just the combining storytelling and data, it's all integrated, right? Telling your impact through storytelling is still the most effective way to reach donors and to build those relationships, but measuring what we do and the impact of what we do, that comes alongside with it, and it's just not something that's important anymore. It's something that we have to do to best manage and steward the resources that we have in an organization, best manage our people to help them prioritize what they do, and best move forward with our goals and objectives as an organization.
Well, I completely agree with both these ladies. I think at our organization, we definitely look at things through a donor's perspective. I had a conversation with someone yesterday who has, as a donor, has invested a lot in social justice causes and certain organizations, and her frustration was that she found she couldn't really get her hands around the difference she was making because she kept seeing homelessness increasing in the city. So imagine being an organization who's saying that they're solving homelessness, and yet every year, we see the homeless count go up and up. So that is a very frustrating circumstance for a lot of donors, and a lot of donors don't even entertain my telephone calls because they think that's what I'm asking for again. So we have a very entrepreneurial board of mostly CEOs who about 10 years ago started to really push us on the question, are we making the difference that we say we're making? So we started a process where we started to actually, as social workers, break through our own barriers to measuring impact. So, as social workers, we think that if we save one life, we're doing our job, which on the surface sounds great. But really, when you start talking about young people and a journey to independent, healthy futures, is being at Covenant House actually producing that for that young person? Or are we just giving them a meal tonight? Are we just giving them a bed tonight and they're just going to end up back on the street in 2 months? So we, bought software, hired people to assess a youth when they come in the door, when we reassess over a period of time as they are experiencing our services. And we have dashboards that we're accountable to our board with and to our donors as well. And after making a lot of mistakes in this area, I think what we have discovered is that when you get better at it, not only is the donor more satisfied and more, feeling a sense of accomplishment, but also our program delivery becomes better. We start to measure our program quality, and our staff get excited because they can actually see in the reports that if they tweak the program a little bit this way, they're actually getting better outcomes in this area. So it's a multifaceted world, not easy, sometimes not fun, but can be very rewarding.
So that's actually a great segue into my next question, and that's, how does your organization define the word impact, and specifically impact measurement?
Yeah, that was a good question to get ahead of time because it allowed me to really think about it. But when I did think about it, it was really, how do we identify the change that we're trying to create? And then if you're thinking about what change are you trying to create, then you really have to think about who is it that you're trying to serve. And so I think that was the clearest way that I could come up with that. And so from an Art Start's point of view, the people that we are serving are children, artists, and educators. And so the change that we're trying to create is that students have a more engaged and activated learning journey, and that artists have opportunities for employability to work in schools, and that teachers think about art as pedagogy, art as an approach to teaching, and that ultimately through that whole kind of formula, that from a society point of view, art is regarded as essential. It's something that is celebrated and elevated as a place in society that is, bigger and greater than what it is right now. So there's like a societal impact as well as like a, core audience's impact, but really it's about change, the change that we're trying to seek.
At Sparrowway, where I used to work, we really defined it as job creation. So everything we did in terms of school feeding programs, educational scholarships, health, deworming programs, all of its impact is really keeping kids in school as long as possible, hoping that they will then be able to stand up on their own 2 feet and be able to have income, create jobs, create skills training, life skills training as well. So job creation was really the major definition of impact for us, that they can stand on their own 2 feet when you're no longer supporting them through the different community initiatives that we had.
I've lost track of the question, Najid.
How do you define impact?
Well,
Or impact measurement is.
I mean, it really depends, I guess, on the lens. You know, if sure. So let's start with the donor lens as a beginnings. As I said, more and more donors are trying to understand the return on their investment. I mean, literally, what is the ROI for their gift? And for the older donors that that were more my generation and are still around to some extent, trust was actually the currency more than anything else. And if sometimes they really just had to see in action, and they would just sort of get the idea, the sense intuitively that you were doing a good job, and so they'd cut you a big check. That doesn't happen so much anymore, particularly with the younger generations and people like Praveen and others who are so focused on ROI in their own businesses that they're looking for ROI in charities as well. And when we're talking to donors about the impact that we have, we're not just talking about bed nights, meals served. I mean, those are things you can count, versus outcomes, versus what happens when you provide a bed and provide meals and provide training. We measure things like our youth in a stable housing setting 6 months after the program. Our youth, how is their mental health scores faring 6 months into our programming? And so when a donor hears this, they feel like they have more evidence and evidence basis for making decisions about how much they support us for and for how long they support us for. And as the CEO, of course, I'm just looking at the bottom line. Since I started at Covenant House and we started these outcome measurement programs, we've gone from a $6 million a year organization to nearly $18 million a year organization in less than 10 years. And that's about outcome measurement. Well, it's not just me. It really is a team of people who really believe in outcome measurement, including the board, who have let us make a lot of mistakes and who were prepared to hear some bad news when we first started measuring impact, because a lot of what we were saying we were doing, the wonderful anecdotal stories, didn't necessarily line up with some of the facts that we discovered after we had been measuring impact for a period of time.
And I actually want to get into that. Just a quick pause for a second. Google did a study in California that looked at, just from the donor lens for a quick second, 70% of donors today are Googling organizations, their ROI, etc., before they donate. That means people care not only about the trust and the, even fact is something that we are arguing about these days, but this is a reality that every organization in this room may be able to get away with for the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But after that, you're seeing a fundamental change in how donors make decisions. On that note of ROI, of data-driven donations, how do you then get away from the fact that the ROI, people think short-term, right? Something like cancer research, for example, it doesn't happen in 48 hours. It doesn't happen in 4 weeks or 4 months or 4 years. It can take decades, even centuries, right? And so how do we, with our donors, with our boards, with our supporters, but also with the general public, tell a story of return on our investment that doesn't happen in even a time that we even know?
I mean, I think you tell the overarching story of how much we've progressed, but also we're trying to do it more as a foundation, share a lot of the impacts of the different investments we made. For example, it was just published at the end of last year, an investment we made in lung cancer, a risk predictive screening model. It's outperformed everything that exists right now. And with something like lung cancer, the chances of survival once it's diagnosed later on in the later stages is very low compared to if you catch it early on. So just sharing those stories with the donors. And then I think one unique thing that the Terry Fox Foundation really has that we're just so grateful for is our volunteers. We have a lot of people in the community, volunteers, sharing their stories of how their struggles and their battles with cancer and how they're alive today because of cancer research. So I think storytelling obviously really resonates people, but having other people tell your story for you is even more impactful.
Navita, with something like art, which changes self-esteem, it changes creativity, it changes all these things that are almost impossible to measure in a 2.754 kind of way. How do you show return on investment? Because not everybody here is doing work that's so tangible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we don't have the answer to that really big question, and I think being part of this panel was a really good invitation to really think deeply about that. I think one of the learnings in my reflection preparing was that the power of a single story is so crucial. And so sometimes when you don't necessarily have the long-term compelling end kind of results that might wow with numbers and facts, the power of a single story is really influential to guide the organization's work and to intrigue or include the investors to really think and see it from the lens of a single person. Because really, ultimately, if one single child is positively influenced through the arts, and that sets them up for this life ahead that they really otherwise would not have had. And we do have stories like that. So I think the reminder for us is that really focus on the single child and know how to tell the story just from a single story.
I'm going to pick on something you said, Krista, for a quick second. You mentioned outcome versus output, and I think that's a really important distinction for those of us that have spent frustrated hours in the impact measurement space. Before we go into defining it, I wanted to ask you something like homelessness, where there are so many factors, regardless of what you do, that can either make or break, more often break, the work you're doing and the cycles and there's so many things that affect the efficacy of your work. Can you maybe get into for everybody here today the difference between outcome and output, but also how then you justify your own work when so much is out of your control?
Well, my people. No, it's okay.
Answer.
No. Oh, really?
I know.
I have perfect answers. So I think that if you talk to my team, they'll tell you that I am a perfectionist, and so when I think it's probably self-evident that providing someone with a single intervention in a life, may help them to have a full tummy today, but it doesn't necessarily, teach the man to fish, right? So that's part of what. When you say that you're on a journey to affect long-term outcomes, you actually have to do that. I think we can say we are, but unless you prove you are, you're not going to be around for a long time. And one of the things that Covenant House, I think, has really recognized and done is that when we say we can affect the arc of a young person's life, we understand that there's a lot of variables. So we started to affect all the variables we could. We developed a continuum of service. I mean, again, being outcomes oriented. If you really are gonna, do what you say you're gonna do, then you've actually got to adapt programs to support that larger outcome. And we literally developed a continuum of service that frames a wrap of services around a young person so that you try and minimize the amount of uncontrollables in your client's world.
Interesting story. When I was posted with the UN, I heard this story about frustration on this issue, and they told the story about the Thailand tsunami that happened in Southeast Asia, and there was tons of UN programming that had spent decades, trying to make things better, working on longer-term outcomes, women's education, breaking the cycle of poverty, and then the tsunami hit, and literally decades worth of work was wiped out. And in law we call that the force majeure. There's nothing. It's literally beyond our control. With that in mind, there's this new body of research in this space called micro outcome, which I find a little bit weird because that seems like output. Navita, I'd love your thoughts on this, and because I think, we want to show ROI not only to our donors but to ourselves. And how do you do that?
So many questions that weren't on the pre-planned list. But it's good. It's definitely a good thought-provoking conversation. One mantra that comes to mind for me, this is from Susan Scott's book, Fierce Conversations. And the statement is that relationships succeed or fail gradually then suddenly. Conversations succeed or fail gradually then suddenly. But it's the gradually then suddenly piece that has come back to me almost every single day of my entire career, is that idea that micro steps, we hear about baby steps all the time, that essentially is the magic solution of how to get anything done. There's so many different ways that people express that. We've gone to many different professional development experiences to how do you tackle those big, complex, wicked problems? Well, you do it, one step at a time, carve off one slice of salami at a time. But really, gradually then suddenly is kind of the assurance that micro is how you start. That's how you move into action. Otherwise, it's all theory, and you get overwhelmed, and you don't know where to start, and you're in this kind of vicious circle. And it is a kind of a challenge as a leader to know that that's your responsibility, to have that wisdom to help guide your team, to be really clear about their outputs, and you're trying to help them with these big outcomes and pressure from the board and donors. So I think the micro piece is kind of a bit of a breath to say, okay, it's okay that it is micro, and that gradually, then suddenly, things are going to happen.
Andrea, maybe you can lean on your past where you did a lot of programming work which had long-term goals, and share some of your experiences or frustrations even.
Yeah, I think the idea of just micro and taking small steps is so important because you want to be a continuously learning organization. You want to have that structure in place, but you want to be able to adapt. For example, the Kenyan government decides to shut down all schools. Not sure when not sure why, not sure when. You want to have kind of definitely the big picture and the outcomes, and you want to have that structure set, but you want to have that flexibility to be able to adapt and roll with it. And I think also from a programmatic perspective, it's really important to have some of the measurements on what will be most impactful from the community come grassroots up. For example, at Spareway, we really tried to move our scholarship program to more of a 60-40 female-male ratio. At Spareway, we didn't actually go into a country or community and say, hey, this is what we want to do. What they did was they identified local leaders in developing countries that they were working with that were doing great things in poverty relief, and came alongside and built capacity through helping them with funding, through helping them with training, helping them with resources. And some of the communities came back and said, hey, I know these are your impact measures and what the organization wants to do, but really in our community, if we did that, that's going to be a hindrance to the boys, because right now all the organizations are just investing in scholarships for girls. So you want to be able to have that structure, but tailor it based on what really will be most impactful in each of the programs in the communities. And just that concept of micro and lean methodology and learning and reviewing and assessing and adapting and changing, I think is just so important as an organization.
I think one common theme the word hasn't been used at is patience, right? Iterative patience, but patience. The idea that we're going to get it wrong, and our donors and our boards and our governments have to understand that nobody knows the answer to these questions, and so they have to preach that sense of patience. And that's not an easy thing to communicate, especially to people who seemingly hold all the power, especially with the dollars. Krista, you talked about dashboards, and I work at a tech company, so I like dashboards. But what I'm going to ask you is, measuring impact, what tools do you use? Whether it's surveys or technology, what tools do you use, and what's worked well, but also what hasn't worked well? You talked about that iterative, kind of frustrated, some things worked, didn't. Can you share some of that so we don't make the same mistakes, please?
Well, we've used it all, and we still use it all. The tools have changed a little bit. When we first started measuring outcomes, or started to think about measuring outcomes in terms of human performance at Covenant House, this was back in the day when there wasn't a lot of this discussion going on. So we founded a software developer. Like, this is 2006 we're talking about here. Found a local software developer who thought he could probably put something together for us, and literally we developed our own software platform for measuring social outcomes at Covenant House. Needless to say, we spent a whole bucket of money and didn't get very far. The thing was a pile of crap, honestly. And everybody's done it, but for our organization, it was a significant investment, and we didn't. That did not become the successful platform long term. But by the time we realized that it was failing, we had developed a culture of performance measurement, and we could see the possibilities, and we got pretty good at data collection. So we learned some stuff along the way. And then one day we discovered that somebody had actually developed a platform in another country that was actually developed by a bunch of young youth workers to measure the performance outcome in social service agencies. And we signed on and bought that package and still use it. It's called Efforts to Outcomes, surprisingly. We also use SurveyMonkey to talk to the young people that we serve and the young people we'd like to serve. We use online platforms to communicate through social media and others to understand, did Covenant House help you? And so we've looked at qualitative results, things like, I feel more confident after having been at Covenant House. Those kinds of squishy things that are also useful.
Just going to dig in there for a sec. How long do you keep relationships with the people you serve? Is it a week, a month, a year, a decade? That long-term data is so important and so valuable. Do you do it, and if so, how, or successfully or unsuccessfully?
Well, what I think about when you ask that question is, I have 4 kids of my own, and they all have varying degrees of interest in staying in touch with me. And frankly, the same applies to the young people at Covenant House. Some of them are really need some help for the next week while they're stuck in Vancouver and trying to get home. Some of them are lifelong residents of the community and want to be here for a long time. And some of them, need more support. So they're with us they technically can be with us from their 16th birthday to their 25th birthday. And we have some kids who are with us for years in our residential program. So it's really dependent on the young person's interest and needs.
Navita, how do you track a 6-year-old doing art? That wasn't a facetious question. I'm actually curious.
Yeah, so the way that we collect and measure all of this is definitely very layered. Internally, organizationally, how we track our own progress towards outcomes is definitely rooted in like a theory of change, and then actual logic models that really break down what are the inputs and how do those relate to the outputs and the outcomes and short-term and long-term. So really having that on paper is definitely a source of clarity to really align. We're just a staff of 10, but even with an organization of that size, you really notice how those tools really help create focus and create engagement and motivation. So those are some of those tools. The piece that I think sometimes undervalue or overlook is the value of observation And so being able to go into a classroom to just observe, when an artist is in residence doing a project with teachers, really activating a hands-on learning experience for kids. They're learning about the life cycle of a salmon through hands-on relationship with clay. Like to do more observation, I think that's an area of immense impact research and data collection that sometimes we think of the survey and we think of the focus group and we think of like the traditional sources, and observation is definitely a source. Also, the other thing that I've learned is if you're going to do a survey, and we do them, it's really the quality of the question or even the way in which the question is asked. So if it is a survey, does it have to be online, and does it have to be SurveyMonkey, and does it have to sound so generic, or could it be actually embedded within a program? So we offer a lot of professional development for artists and teachers. And so rather than like send them the SurveyMonkey link that evening at the end of the workshop, how could we embed some of the questions as like a free write, creative writing exercise right within the experience? Because if you design a question that is really thoughtful and you provide maybe a beautiful piece of paper with an interesting pen, maybe the quality of their reflection might be different than if they're like, oh, SurveyMonkey, I always get this, let me quickly just finish it off because I feel like I have to. And so how would the quality of our understanding of impact change, not because we did anything different in our program, but that we just asked the question in a slightly different way? Because we're quite accustomed to the normalized way that things are experienced. So to interrupt that, I think is a really interesting way that we're exploring, trying to better understand our impact by doing the same activity, just asking the question in a different way. And P.S., those are the types of skills that an arts integrated approach teach. Like, how do you do things differently? How do you ask questions? How do you think of a different way to create the answer to the same solution? So, we try to practice that in our work because that's what organizationally we're trying to create, but that's an example.
I'm going to ask for a little bit of openness on the next question about things that haven't worked. What would you do? What hasn't worked in your journey to measure the impact you're making, and what would you change in the current operations?
So since I have the mic, can I just show that one slide?
Sure, Phil, if you could, yeah, please.
Okay, so this is what hasn't worked: is being kind of at the intersection of trying to be socially innovative with your work, trying to be iterative and responsive in the moment, yet also trying to respond to the needs and the expectations of donors and funders, is that we're often forced in grant applications, what are your outcomes going to be? So we will say, well, we're going to do this, plus this, plus this, plus this, and it's going to result in this, which is going to be our intended impact. Great. We send it off the grant application, we get the money, and then for the final report, we have to respond back really to what we said we were going to do. But if you go to the next slide, this is something that really reflects the reality, and it would be great to be able to be open about this so that A plus a different version of B plus 3 different trial and errors of C, and actually we had to do more of D and none of E at all, and ultimately we didn't do our intended impact, but we got to a revised intended impact, which was actually better. And so to be able to be give yourself permission that that's a good thing, and that's how you get to socially innovative results. And if you were closed to that and you got to your intended impact, really was that impact. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Woo!
Challenges, mistakes you've made, and how would you change the way you currently do things?
I'd say, everyone would say capacity is a challenge and technology is a challenge, but it's really important to just kind of start somewhere and keep building on that. From my experience, I feel like the people management part of it can, it's so important. I think the technical side of the metrics, what you want to measure, how do we measure impact, tracking, what is the input, what is the activity, how is it going to link to output, that's so important, but the cultural shift is even more important, I think, and even navigating the political climate. When you look at the politics of performance assessment, and you're talking to people, all of a sudden, different stakeholders are, oh, you're measuring what I do. This is going to affect the budget I'm going to get next year. This is going to affect how you look at how effective I am in the organization. So I think one of the things I've really learned, just because regardless of the size of your organization, I think everyone will feel like they're overworked and under-resourced to really spend that extra time on the change management part of it, the cultural part of it, the communication part of it, and really make it a consultative process as much as possible as well. So that's something I definitely learned from experience to really watch out for.
Krista?
God, I'm just thinking, I have thousands of mistakes to choose from. Where do I start with this? Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what people would be most interested in hearing about. Well, probably a couple things. And I just told you about our investing in our own software, Fandango, which was just brutal. Don't recommend it. Please find something that's really well crafted off the shelf. I think one of the biggest challenges, and you've alluded to this for sure, is that the turnover levels. I mean, you probably see what the turnover levels are like in the nonprofit sector. I mean, if we did a survey right now, and I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up because your boss is probably in the room, but how many when we survey how many people in the nonprofit sector are contemplating changing organizations, it's some huge number. Like every day, half the people in the organization are thinking about leaving, and so you can breed this wonderful culture of measurement. And you can have some really highly skilled, very well-trained people who are in your data department who are, producing reports. They leave tomorrow and the whole thing falls apart. So that we've made all those mistakes and have, it relied too much on this one person who's got all the knowledge and owns everything. We've stopped doing that because you have to have more than one person, several people. You need as many people in the organization as possible who understand what you're doing, have bought into the culture, and actually have the technical skills to be able to deliver on the reporting.
We've got about 8 minutes and 22 seconds left, so I'm going to open it up for questions. Gabriel and I think Philip have microphones. Yeah, please.
So my question was for Navita. You mentioned that something about how you were measuring impact according to a theory of change, and maybe I'm the only one, but I don't know what you mean by that. So I'd love to hear a little bit more.
That's great. Yeah, we're in the process of developing a theory of change for Art Starts because I was hearing this word and it sounded so, interesting. But essentially, it's this idea of being able to write very succinctly what exactly, and that's what I was reflecting impact means is the change you're trying to create. What exactly are you trying to change? And then if you root it back to, well, then who are the levers that you have to really think about? So then it's like, who is it that you serve? It's kind of a reverse engineering process to say, ultimately, if you're trying to change this thing, then you kind of look at the machine that creates all of the mechanisms towards that so that you could identify. And that's kind of what that graph also said, like a little bit more of this, a little bit less of this, tweak this way. It's like a map of how you would be able to really hone in on what exactly you can do from a micro to a macro level to actually then create this change. And it's not a static thing. It's not like you would create this theory of change and then like that's it and off you go to work. It's evolving, it changes, but ultimately if you can't name it, that I'm trying to change this and these are all the things that influence that and this is how I can influence this that influences that, then you're not really actually changing that big thing. Yeah, but worth something kind of exploring and looking into. I'm learning myself.
I'm not going to let you escape on that one. So you talked a lot about misses, and that is Could you walk us through a really concrete example of like what does theory of change mean for the work you're doing?
Great. So for us, the theory of change ultimately is we feel in society art is regarded as extra, like just at a very basic level. We feel art is regarded as extra. So we think about why. Why is that so? And we believe that it's the way young children are taught to think about art at school. It's a separate subject. It's considered something only for some people. You know, kindergarten children and grade 1 children and grade 2 children maybe will love art, but by the time they grow up, not so much. You know, if you're familiar with Sir Ken Robinson at all, it's the most watched TED Talk in the entire world. So there must be a point there that resonates with people. But basically saying how we educate children from the head up, and we basically ignore that they have a body. And so an arts-based approach to learning is not about art, actually. It's really about a full body. It's about a full acknowledging that there is multiple intelligences, and that there's a way in which that we experience the world that art lends a really amazing opportunity to create that. So our theory of change is, why is art extra? Why is it not essential? And how do we make sure that children are taught that so that we can actually make that change?
Kids of the same age. Take kids of the same age, kids who have gone through your program and kids who have not, and you compare it, you can show the difference of what your program is doing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's where we're trying to focus on that single story and multiple single stories to really be able to see that over time. So yes, that would be a great approach.
Any other questions? Down here. Thanks, Sam.
Hi.
Dr. Scott.
It's not really a question. I just have a story to do about that. I believe in art, and I've always believed in art. And so when my son, who always had blank paper, I didn't believe in coloring books. I didn't allow coloring books. In grade 1, he was asked to do the Horn of Plenty, and he took it up to his teacher, and he said, "Mrs. Kodish, you must have spent a lot of time drawing this. I'd like to hand it back, but I'd rather do my own." She called me up to say there was a problem, and that she wouldn't be able to mark off he'd done his learning outcome because he actually wanted to draw it. Good thing I was an educator. I could inform her, and we moved on from that. But it is a different aspect in life. I just thought I'd share that one for you.
Question here.
Hi, so I'm with an organization which runs an event series called G-Day, which is an empowerment celebration for girls ages 10 to 12 and their caregivers. And so we run events, one-day events. And at the end of each event, we survey the participants, the girls and the adults that come. And just this year, we switched to a model of feedback that was more graphic, because we felt that it was kind of like a bummer at the end of the day to do like this like homework looking form for the kids. Like the whole point is for it to be a celebration, and so trying to bring some graphic qualities to that, like this, bring shapes and all these different things into it. But I feel like rather than measuring the percentage of girls who could say that this has had some kind of impact, like bring a percentage to it, that the strongest impact are always the free space where they say, my favorite part about G-Day was this because it made me feel this way. Like things that when you read it, it like brings tears to your eyes almost. And that's the part where, when you say that to a donor, they're like, they're moved and excited to be a part of that. And so I guess like, how important is it in measuring impact to bring these like quantifiable numbers sides versus like reading a child's handwriting that shows that they've had some kind of profound experience?
Krista, Andrea, do you have thoughts on that?
It's a blend. It's a blend. I think you need both. I think you need the qualitative and the quantitative. You need the heart story. You need the beautiful story about how this has changed a young person's life. You need to you know, you need to connect human being to human being in order to really be moved. But at the same time, you've got the hard-headed assessment that a foundation grantor is making, or you know, a CEO of a tech company who really wants to see the numbers. So I think there's room for all of it.
I definitely agree, and I think it's a great question. I spent about 2 months in Angola, and it was a consulting project, and basically the board and the executive leadership had tasked me to review their Angola program and make recommendations on how to move forward. So this organization actually flew planes. Their mission was to help organizations deliver aid to the most remote and isolated regions in the world. So during the 27-year war, they were the ones flying World Food Program, UN, doctors out into the most remote areas, because at one point in Angola, they had estimated they had more landmines in Angola than they had children. Fast forward to today, it's a different world. They have more of a transportation system and much more developed. Long story short, if you looked at just the metrics and the numbers for that particular program in terms of lives benefited, you know, pounds of food getting into the rural area, doctors, it didn't actually make sense from a business perspective to be there. It was 6 times more expensive than a country like Mozambique in a similar situation, 12 times more expensive than running the same program in another country. But the things that you can't measure, like the fact that the Angolan government won't let any other kind of charities come in, that there's only a handful of charities there. If you leave, that you'll never come back, that these people really, in a measurable sense, need more help. I think going back to the mission of, you know, why you're here, to reach the most remote people, you can't measure why it's more important, and the numbers tell a very different story. The numbers say, from an impact perspective, potentially you should scale down or move elsewhere, but you really have to look at all those things that you can't measure and include it in your evaluations.
So that just goes back to this idea of learning. So like doing an evaluation like that, you could be trying to prove something with numbers and metrics, or you're trying to improve something because you're actually trying to learn with an actual tangible explanation, and that could allow you to like validate the way that you're doing your program or learn something about how you're doing your program to really influence that. So it needs to be both, and it's proving things and also improving things.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but to Krista, to Andrea, to Navita, thank you very, very much for today.